Good morning, ILTexas campuses. How are you all at the start of 2020? I hope it's been a great day for you all so far. And today we have a great way to start off our new year. We have a very special guest with us all the way from Beijing in China, Mr. Paul Haenle. Mr. Paul Haenle holds the Maurice R. Greenberg Director's Chair at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center based in Tsinghua University in Beijing, China. He served as a director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia Affairs on the National Security Council staffs of former Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama, prior to joining Carnegie. And he has graciously taken time out of his day to speak to us. Please give a warm ILTexas welcome to Mr. Paul Haenle.
Well, thank you very much. It really is an honor to be what I understand as the first speaker in the ILTexas Leadership Speaker Series for 2020. And I want to send my greetings from Beijing. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Great. Should I continue?
Please do, yes.
Great. Well, I should tell you that I am speaking to you from my dining room here in Beijing, China. It's about 10:15 at night. I'm in the central business district here in Beijing, downtown Beijing, 20 minutes from Tiananmen Square in the Forbidden City, in Zhongnanhai, where the Chinese President Xi Jinping and the leadership reside, and about 2 hours from the Great Wall. So I'm on the other side of the world from you, and again, it's a pleasure to be with you. I want to talk this evening about, or this morning your time, about the importance of a strong relationship between the U.S. and China, and how future leaders can improve relations. You know, I believe very strongly in a robust U.S. China relationship, and I've worked hard throughout my own career to try to contribute to that. And I think there is a significant role for all of you as future leaders. And I know that your program at ILTexas is well known. It is focused, I know, on exceptional leadership in the international environment. It puts a priority on language learning, including English, Spanish, and Chinese. And it focuses on developing the mind, the body, and character. And I think you're all preparing yourself for this important work ahead. And I hope some of you will take a strong interest in China and do what you can to make sure that our two countries build a constructive and a beneficial relationship for the United States, China, and the international community. And I will tell you that, you know, while you're in high school now, probably seems a long way off that you're going to be playing a leadership role on these issues. And I'm here to tell you it's closer than you think. So as I think back to my own time, when I graduated high school, I went off to an engineering school, and I wanted to be an engineer, but I took ROTC, Army ROTC in college. And when I graduated college, I decided to serve in the Army on active duty. And I thought I would do that for 4 years. But in the end, it turned out to be a 21-year time, 21 years of time that I spent in the Army. And during that time, I had the opportunity to serve all around the world. My first assignment was in Germany. 6 months, I arrived in Germany 6 months before the Berlin Wall fell, and the Cold War, as we know it, was coming to a close. And so it was a time where there were huge geopolitical changes going on. And you know, I was a young Army lieutenant serving in an armored division in Germany, and that really sparked my interest in international issues. And I had the opportunity to learn German when I was there, and I spent 3 years altogether. During my time there, I was sent to Desert Storm in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, where I served in the first armored division. I did a tour then in Korea, And while I was in Korea, I traveled to China. This was 1994, in the summer of 1994, so about 25 years ago. It was a very different China back then than we see today. I traveled there with my mother, my sister, and a friend. We went to Xi'an. Many of you have probably heard of Xi'an. It's the home of the terracotta warriors. And these are terracotta clay figures that were built 221 BC by the aides to the first emperor of China, Emperor Qin Shi Huang. And you get a real sense, I got a real sense of China's very, very long history. I then traveled to Shanghai, and I stood on what they call the Bund, looking out across into an area called Pudong, which was really a farmland back then, but they were buildings that were coming up. And one in particular was the Pearl TV Tower. And you could get a sense in 1994 that this was a country that was moving very quickly. They had embarked on an economic reform and opening up to the outside world under Deng Xiaoping, the leader after Mao Zedong died. And in 1994, it was very easy to have the sense that this was a place with vitality and dynamism, and it was on the move. And with the population that it has today of 1.4 billion people, a country that size, moving that quickly, it was pretty clear to most that China was going to be a key actor in the international community, a major power. After several decades of a couple centuries of being behind other major powers. I then traveled to Beijing during that trip in 1994, which is the political center of China, and rode my bicycle around Beijing. There were hardly any cars on the road, and this is only 25 years ago, and so not that long. But while I was there, I met an Army captain who was the first Army captain to be posted at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing to do training. And through that just chance meeting, I learned about this program in the Army called the China Foreign Area Officer Program. And after a tour of duty in the Middle East, I started this program, which included Chinese language learning at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. It included spending 1 year in China to learn about China and to improve my language capabilities. It was during that year, in 1998, that I had a chance to travel to every province in China, not just the capitals of Beijing and the financial capital of Shanghai, but to get out and see the rest of the country. And China is a very big country geographically, and there are the disparity throughout the country is pretty significant. And I visited very poor rural areas. I visited cities that were up and coming, and again had a strong sense that this was a country that was on the move. And then after my 1 year in China, the Army sent me to Harvard University to do a master's degree in East Asian Studies. It's a wonderful program that the Army has. Part of me telling you about it is to potentially spark your interest in the military. There's a lot of great opportunities. And my time in the military, you're focused on leadership there at ILTexas. When you serve in the Army, you learn a lot about leadership, and you have an opportunity to apply it and to lead people in that capacity. After my training was done, I had the opportunity to serve in a number of China-related jobs, and including at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., the Defense Department. And then the last 5 years of my Army career, I was able to serve in the White House in the National Security Staff. And I joined under President Bush in his first term. And I was able to work on China. And I should say that, we have just completed 4 decades, 40 years of U.S. China relations after we normalized relations in 1979. So we haven't had formal relations with China really for that long. We normalized the relationship in 1979. It was after a trip that President Nixon took in 1972 to kind of break the ice and get the relationship going after a long period of isolation. And then under President Carter in 1979, we normalized relations with China. President Carter, President Reagan, President George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush, President Clinton, President Bush 43, President Obama, and President Trump. Those are the 7 presidents that have been in office since normalization of U.S. China relations just 40 years ago. We have had a fairly consistent policy over 6 of those 7 presidents. And our policy was basically to engage China through robust engagement through business, academia, military engagement, economic and trade engagement, to cooperate with China where we have common interests, and to manage the differences that we have with China. Either manage them or resolve them if we can. And through our engagement, we had hoped that we could see a China that would open up more politically and that would move its economy to one that's more based on markets, more of a market capitalist system like we have in the United States and you see in other countries around the world. During the 40 years of U.S. China relations up until now, we've had a number of crises that have emerged. In 1989, there was a crackdown of students here in Beijing at Tiananmen Square, and that created a crisis in U.S. China relations. In 1996, when the island of Taiwan was holding its presidential election, the Chinese were launching missiles near the island to try to put pressure on Taiwan. And the United States decided to send in aircraft carriers as a measure of deterrence to tell the Chinese to stand down. I'm threatening Taiwan. In 1999, NATO forces led by the United States accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Huge mistake with pretty significant consequences for our bilateral relationship with China. And then in 2001, at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, one of our aircraft, called an EP-3 Navy aircraft that was flying along the coast of China, collided with a Chinese plane, a fighter aircraft. The Chinese pilot died, and the U.S. plane crash landed on the Chinese island of Hainan, where it stayed for 12 days. The plane and its crew stayed for 12 days before they were released. These incidents presented real crises in the U.S.-China relationship. But in each case, we have been able to work through those crises, negotiate, use creative diplomacy, and ultimately get to a better place. And so what you have seen over the last 40 years is a relationship that has had a number of difficult points, but over that 40-year trajectory has generally moved along a trajectory of improvement, similar to the stock market, where you would see ups and downs in the stock market, but the general trajectory has been up. Now, I worked in the administration of George W. Bush, and I had the opportunity to work in the U.S. Embassy, to work in the Pentagon, and to work in the White House during his tenure. And I should say that it got off to a bit of a rocky start. George W. Bush, during his first presidential campaign, before he became president, actually called China a strategic competitor. Said China is not a strategic partner, which is what President Clinton, had called China. He said it's a strategic competitor. And when he first came into office, as I mentioned, his first international crisis that he had to deal with was the EP-3 crisis, which took place in April of 2001, just 3 months after he became president. Shortly after the EP-3 crisis, he approved a very large arms sales package to Taiwan. And then when he was asked in an interview what he would do if China attacked Taiwan, he said he would do whatever it took to defend Taiwan. And that was a shift away from a policy of strategic ambiguity, where we aren't specific, our leaders in the United States aren't specific about what they would do in the event of some sort of confrontation between China and Taiwan. China was not pleased with this, with the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, and concluded that we were moving into a period of very difficult relations. But something happened in September of 2001, and you will all, of course, have heard about 9/11 and are embarking on the global war on terror, prosecuting a war in Afghanistan, and then a couple years later in Iraq. And our relationship with China improved during that period. And in a sense, I think our strategic attention for the next 2 decades was really focused, close to 2 decades, was really focused on the Middle East during the 8 years of the Bush administration, most certainly, and even really during the 8 years of the Obama administration. And what was happening during that time was China was getting stronger and stronger. Its economy was growing by double digits every year for almost 3 decades. And with those extra economic resources, it was also able to build its military capability. When I was working in the Pentagon, when I was working at the embassy in China, we were watching China's military become more capable and more powerful. But it wasn't until the end of the Obama administration when we saw China very aggressively assert its claims in the South China Sea that we really began to see those capabilities unfold. And this created some frustration in the Obama administration as they opposed the moves that China took in the South China Sea, but China continued to take those steps. Also during the Obama administration, the Chinese have been trying to acquire technology through a number of means. Because China has been behind in technological development, and Chinese leaders strongly believe that future power in the world will be determined by the country that is able to harness technology and develop technology. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, these kind of technologies will be very important in determining a nation's power in the future. And so China, through a number of means, has been acquiring technology. One of those means is through cyber theft, of actually stealing technology from American companies. And during the Obama administration, U.S. companies grew very frustrated that their intellectual property in the hundreds of billions of dollars range was being illicitly acquired by China. And then, of course, there's a range of trade and economic issues that even during the President George W. Bush administration, since China joined the WTO, there has been a number of disagreements on the trade and economic side that we have been unable to address in a satisfactory way through President Bush, President Obama. And these frustrations emerged and were part of the discussion and the debate when President Trump took office. And this is the first president who has really taken a much tougher approach towards China, especially on the areas that I mentioned of economics and trade, on the areas of cyber theft and the like. President Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations said he's been working on foreign policy for close to 4 decades, and he has not seen consensus on a foreign policy issue change as fast and as dramatic as he has with regard to China. And so we've seen a real shift in the Trump administration in terms of the approach that the Trump administration is taking to China. The Trump administration talks about a much more competitive element with China now that China is a much stronger and more capable country. And they have moved, President Trump, of course, has put a large amount of tariffs onto China to try to convince China to make some of the changes to its economy that have been asked for by President Bush, President Obama, and now again, President Trump. And so we see the beginning of a much more era of competition, strategic competition with China across a number of realms. We're looking at the economics and trade, of course, but when you move beyond economics and trade, you have technology competition, security and military competition, and you even now see competition from an ideological standpoint. So we're beginning to see the outlines of a very different approach with China. Now, my own view is that the framework that we used in the Bush administration and the Obama administration in dealing with China is still the framework we should use today. We still need to work with China to try to manage our differences and resolve our differences. We may need to be much more clearer and much more assertive in doing so because we're dealing with a stronger and more capable China today. But we also should continue to cooperate and collaborate with China where it is in our interest to do so. There are a number of areas where we should cooperate with China on the issue of arms control, non-proliferation, preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction, pandemic disease that can spread across countries' borders. You can have a pandemic disease that begins in one country and ultimately goes to many countries around the world. We should be working with our Chinese partners on those issues. So there's a lot to deal with. The issue of North Korea. This is an issue that I worked on in the Bush administration. How to get the North Koreans to abandon their nuclear weapons program. How to work with China to get Iran to abandon its nuclear weapons program. There's a lot we should be working with China. So while we move to an era of greater competition, I would say we should not abandon cooperation. And this is something that we haven't yet seen from the Trump administration. They've been very much focused on the areas of disagreement and the much more competitive dynamic in the relationship. At some point, we're going to have to figure out how to be a strategic competitor with China, but also how to be a strategic cooperator with China. So with that, let me end it there. And I really look forward to hearing your questions. And I may ask you a few questions because I'm interested to know what you all think as well.
Absolutely, Mr. Haenle. Thank you so much for this insight. And as you may know, we have about 3,000 ILTexas students throughout our state, and every campus has prepared one or two questions for you. So we're going to turn it over to our first campus, Lancaster DeSoto. Can we hear your question, please?
Yes, thank you. Hello. How do you think the climate of politics and government are affecting the youth of today and possibly the future?
Well, that's a great question. Domestic politics in both countries have a huge impact on the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China. In the U.S., we're seeing a political environment that's much more polarized and much more divided. In China, you see an environment where there's a lot of political tightening going on, a lot more political repression. People are worried about saying things. People are being very, very cautious. And news and flow of information is tightly controlled here in China. You also see something which is worrisome to me, and that is the way we describe each other is changing. It's becoming much more antagonistic and much more hardened and hostile. So, for example, in the United States, when people talk about China, talk about a China threat increasingly. Not everyone, but you hear people saying China is a strategic competitor, they're an economic predator, they're a military threat, they're an ideological rival. It's very hardened language. In China, you hear a narrative that says the United States is trying to block our rise. The United States is trying to contain China. China is growing more powerful, and the United States is intent to keep us down. And I think we have to work very hard to begin to change those narratives to something that is much more comprehensive in nature, where again, you want to cooperate, you want to work with China. There are 350,000 Chinese students in the United States. There are a lot of American students, and I hope more American students will come to China. When we interact on a human level, a people-to-people level, you don't hear those kind of descriptions in those very suspicious narratives. So this is something that I think we need to work on. Now, your question was, how does it affect the youth in both countries? I'm old and you're young. So I want to know from you how you think it affects the youth.
I think it affects the youth because how they perceive the government and the politics is how they will go through their daily lives of thinking about, because they're so influenced on. So what the government or the politicians say will affect them in their communities.
Absolutely. I think it ultimately has an impact. And one of the things I'll just say on this question is there is a very hostile narrative that emanates from Washington, D.C. on China. But when you move outside of China, outside of Washington, D.C., and you go to states and cities and local communities, you don't see those hardened views when it comes to China. And so, but I will say, if this approach continues from Washington, D.C., I agree with you. I think it will begin to affect the way our youth and the way the rest of the country begins to see China. So this is something I think we have to pay close attention to. And it's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our Lancaster student, and I very much agree with the point she brought up that our youth very much does look up to our government, and the way we perceive it very greatly affects how we perceive our own future. I would like to apologize because I've been saying your name wrong, Mr. Haenle. But now we have another question coming from our Windmill Lakes Orem campus. Please let us hear your question, Windmill Lakes.
Thank you. My question is, what was it like transitioning from being a member of the military to a businessman?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, I've had the opportunity in the military to do a number of different transitions. In the military, you end up having opportunities to work on a number of issues, but experience in the military helps you develop a number of things. First of all, it is what you are all focused there on in your program, which is developing leadership skills. And the military focuses on that. It helps you in the area of problem solving. So identifying a problem and then putting together a plan of action to resolve that problem, figuring out how to work with other people and other agencies to build coalitions and work with people of all different types to find solutions. And that's really what leadership is all about. And so from my own experience, the experience that I had in the military from when I was a first lieutenant, second lieutenant, all the way to when I was a lieutenant colonel, I was able to take all those skills that I learned and apply those when I was in the White House, which is a very political environment. I and apply those when I experienced as part of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is a foreign policy think tank, for 10 years. And it's really been a surprise to me that the skills and the experience that I had in the military put me in a very good position to be successful in a think tank. So I would encourage anyone who's at all interested in the military to learn more about it and to try to see if there are opportunities you may be interested in. You know, I don't think you can go wrong by, serving your country, getting some leadership training, additional leadership training. And I know you get a lot there at ILTexas. I understand that that's a big part of what you all do. But I think it will be very, very useful in whatever you do. But a military experience can help you hone those skills in and provide you with some really concrete skills that you can bring to any endeavor, whether it's business, as you said, whether it's politics, or whether it's in foreign policy work.
Thank you so much to the Windmill Lakes campus for that question. And after this, we have another question coming from our College Station campus. College Station, are you there?
Hi, Mr. Haenle. We are just howdy from the College Station campus, and my question for you today is, what was it about China that made you want to work and live there?
Well, I mentioned in my opening remarks a couple things. One is that when I graduated college and I had my first Army assignment, I moved to Germany, West Germany, and I lived there for 3 years. And during that time, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the Soviets left East Germany and went back to the Soviet Union, and Germany reunified. East and West Germany reunified, and I was there, and the official reunification happened in 1991, and I was still in Germany at the time. Those were significant geopolitical shifts in the world. It was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, I found myself in Iraq as part of Desert Storm, fighting a war with the Iraqis who had invaded Kuwait. And a year later, I was living in the Republic of Korea. During those first 3 or 4 years in the Army, serving in different parts of the world, I just became very interested in international issues and foreign policy and national security through that experience. And then something happened. I traveled to China. And I would encourage all of you first to just travel as much as you can. It really opens up your view of the world, and you learn an incredible amount through interacting with people and seeing different places and trying to understand the way others in the world see things. And so when I traveled to China, as I mentioned, I went to Xi'an and I went to Shanghai and Beijing. And when I was in Shanghai and I looked out across in 1994 at this farmland that was being developed into a major city, you could just get the sense that this was a country that was ready to make significant, fast moves and develop in their own economic development. When I moved back to China in 1998, and I went down to Shanghai and I looked across at those farmlands, it had all been developed. It was a major skyline in Shanghai. So this entire area that had been farmlands in just 4 or 5 years turned into a major skyline as part of the financial hub of China. So this is a country that has moved very fast. And from a geopolitical standpoint, it was very clear that China would begin to play an increasingly influential and important role, and that our country's, United States' relationship with China would grow even more important. And so I thought, if I want to be involved in international issues and foreign policy, I want to learn a language that's challenging, that's probably one of the hardest languages to learn in the world, so that I can contribute to helping my own country develop a constructive and fruitful relationship with one of the most important countries as part of one of the most important bilateral relationships, the U.S. China relationship that I can. So I saw it as very challenging, very interesting. I knew China was going to change dramatically, and I knew that it would be important to my country. And I was just very interested in it. And so I've really enjoyed the study of China and the work that I've been able to do while I was in the Army and after I left the Army. And if you can find something that you're interested in that you can pursue with all your enthusiasm and all your energy, you'll find real self-satisfaction in that kind of endeavor.
Absolutely, Mr. Haenle. And I think I can speak on behalf of the ILTexas campuses when I confirm that Chinese is indeed difficult, but it's a challenge we embrace. Following this, we have a question from our Arlington Grand Prairie High School. You guys there?
Hello, Mr. Haenle. My name is Edward Aguilar, and my question is, from 2007 to 2009, you served as a White House representative. Do you believe that nuclear negotiations were handled responsibly with North Korea?
Well, that's a great question. And I'd be glad to talk about my experience. You know, during the time that I worked on the North Korea issue as the White House representative to the six-party talks, which is the framework that we used in negotiating with the North Koreans. And it involved a number of countries. It involved, of course, the United States. It involved our allies in Asia, which are the Republic of Korea, not North Korea, but South Korea, Japan. It also involved China, and China actually served as the chair of the six-party talks, and it involved Russia. When I joined the six-party talks in 2007, we were making good progress on trying to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. And the North Koreans had agreed to shut down their plutonium production factory, which was developing weaponized plutonium for nuclear weapons. The North Koreans, through the negotiations in the six-party talks, had agreed to shut that facility down and to begin to disable and eventually to dismantle those facilities. That was achieved through good work, collaboration with our allies, as I mentioned, but also with China. It was very important, our cooperation with China during that time. My job was actually as China director to the president. It was sort of an additional responsibility I was given to be the White House rep to those six-party talks. But it made sense because it was the first time we were working closely with China on an issue that is of strategic importance to both the United States and China. So the cooperation with China during that time was good, and I'll give you some examples. I traveled to North Korea about half a dozen times, probably 5 or 6 times to North Korea to negotiate with the North Korean officials. Before I traveled there several times with a delegation of 5 or 6, but on a few occasions I traveled just with one other State Department officer. And we would stop in Seoul, and we would stop in Tokyo, and we'd meet with our allies. Then we would continue on to Beijing. And before we went into North Korea, we'd sit down with our Chinese counterparts and we would say, you know, here's our plan. This is what we're planning to do when we talk to the North Koreans in Pyongyang. And often our Chinese counterparts would say, well, that sounds pretty good, but you might think about adding this, or you might think about doing this a little bit differently. We would go into North Korea, we would negotiate, and when we came out of North Korea, we would go straight to Beijing and we would meet with those same counterparts. And we would tell them what we heard, and we would tell them about our experience in those negotiations. And we would tell them what we thought it meant, what our analysis or assessment was of the situation. Many times our Chinese counterparts would say, well, we have a different view, and this is why. Through that kind of collaboration, we came to an understanding of North Korea that was much more sophisticated, that took in Chinese perspectives. And China, of course, borders North Korea. They've lived next to each other for their whole lives. They know each other much better than we know the North Koreans. And so it was through that kind of collaboration that we were able to, I think, make progress. Now, we ultimately did not succeed during the Bush administration, but that's not because of U.S. China cooperation. It's because the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il at the time, this is the father of the current leader. In August of 2008, at the very end of the Bush administration, he had a stroke, and it was clear that he didn't have much longer to live. And so the country, North Korea, went into a leadership succession phase, and his three sons were competing to be the person to take over from Kim Jong-il. And when a country goes through a domestic political event like that, it takes a lot of inward and internal focus. And it was clear they were no longer interested in negotiating through the six-party talks. And ultimately, they moved to launching missiles again and conducting nuclear tests. And we have not ever gotten back to the six-party talks again. And as you know, this has been a big priority for President Trump. So I hope I answered your question, and thank you for asking it.
Thank you so much, Grand Prairie, for the question. And following this, we're going to bring it on home to the Katy West Park campus. Here we are. You know, I'm hosting from here. Let's turn it over to Alyssa.
您好，早上好，我叫伊丽莎，我是的。您好，早上好，我叫伊丽莎，我是德州国际领袖学校这一年级的学生，欢迎您。我的问题是，你在中国工作和生活的时候，国际知识的改变对中国民众的看法有什么影响呢？
Now, for those who do not speak Chinese, I will raise your hand. First of all, thank you for your time, Mr. Haenle. From Westbrook High School, warm welcome. Thank you for your time. So, in your time living and working in China, how have the Chinese opinions of the United States changed throughout time in different political climates?
首先，谢谢你的问题，是非常好的一个问题。我觉得这个中国的对美国的看法的变化不是很大。I'll use English so that everybody can understand. Thank you for your question. It's a very good question. I think, first of all, I would say that in large part, I believe that Chinese people like Americans, and Americans like Chinese. We get along well, as I said, at the people-to-people level, at the human level. There are 350,000 Chinese students living and studying in China, in the United States. The current president of China, Xi Jinping, when he became president back in 2012, his daughter was at Harvard University studying for her bachelor's degree. There's a huge amount of interaction between the United States and China, and we have a lot of friendships and a lot of bridges that have been built during that time. The thing that I worry about, of course, is that as these narratives change, as we begin to develop these descriptions at the national level, government to government descriptions, it goes back to that first question that smart student asked about, you know, how the domestic politics in both countries what kind of influence does that have on the way that people perceive our two countries. And, you know, I think we have to be very careful, right? We can have concerns with China. We can have issues that we want to raise because we disagree with China. But I would say we have to be careful to to not hate the sinner, but to hate the sin. We cannot castigate a country or its people for problems that we have in our bilateral relationship. And we have to be, I think this is one of the concerns that I have going forward. We have to be very careful about how we talk about each other. I think if we can get a trade deal, and it looks like one might be achieved today, keep your eye on the news. The Chinese chief negotiator is in Washington, D.C., and I think he's going to meet with President Trump today and announce a phase one trade deal. I think that will begin to have a positive impact on the relationship. But we've got to take the momentum from that and continue, because this trade deal isn't the best trade deal in the world. We need to continue on to the next phases. And we also need to move beyond trade and economics and try to address some of the other issues that I mentioned in the security and the military space, in the areas of technology, and in other areas of the relationship which are becoming more contentious. We need, if we can get a deal on trade now, we need to begin to replicate that and work on other areas of the relationship that are contentious.
谢谢 Mr. Haenle.
Thank you, Davis Park High School. You're doing me proud. After this, we have a question from our Keller Saginaw campus. Please let Mr. Haenle know your question, Keller Saginaw.
Good morning, Mr. Haenle. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak to us. Keller Saginaw would like to know, since President Trump has taken a more aggressive stance on China, how do you see this change in policy in our future?
Well, you're right. President Trump and this administration has taken a tougher approach to China. My own view is that a tougher approach was required. And I worked for one of the candidates that was running for president in 2016 by the name of Jeb Bush. You should all know Jeb Bush because I know the Bush family is very popular in Texas. I wanted to see Jeb Bush become president. He, of course, didn't succeed, and Donald Trump eventually took the Republican nomination and won the presidency. But I can tell you through my discussions, and I had an opportunity to meet with Jeb Bush before he announced that he was running for president and talk to him about China. And I can tell you that he was concerned about those areas that I mentioned before. He was concerned about what the Chinese military was doing in the South China Sea. He was concerned about cyber theft of American intellectual property. He was concerned about economics and trade relationship, and that the Chinese had not moved forward on some of its commitments to reform. These were the areas that he spoke to me about. And I think if he was president, he would have been tougher in those areas. I have many Democratic friends, and I have a number that worked for Hillary Clinton when she ran for president, and they all tell me the same thing, that Hillary Clinton felt that we need to be tougher on China in those areas where we disagree and where we think the Chinese, through their own policies and behaviors, are undermining our own interests. But I think the caution that I have with the Trump administration is that they seem to have abandoned the idea that we still need to cooperate with China. Right. And I think that we can be tougher with China. We can compete with China in a more aggressive way. And we're going to have to, because they're making significant developments in a number of areas across the board. So we're going to have to compete with China. The question is, what kind of competition are we going to have with China? Is it the kind that you find between sports teams like the New York Yankees and the Boston Red Sox? Or is it the kind of competition you see between the Bloods and the Crips, which is going to damage the United States, damage China, and cause great turbulence and instability in the international community? So I think that we've got to balance out our approach to China more than we see today. Clearly, we see the much stronger competitive piece but we cannot abandon the effort to cooperate with China, collaborate with China, work with China where it's in our interest to do so.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Keller Saginaw High School. And our last question comes from Garland High School up in Dallas. Please let us hear your question.
Hello, Mr. Haenle. This is Garland High School, and my name is Ken,
You got
representing.
a rowdy group there.
晚上好，吃了吗您？
You got a rowdy group of students there. They seem pretty fired up.
Yeah.
How come this group seems much more motivated than the others?
Yeah. Use our Chinese internet language to say, 我们最有排面儿啊，
哇，所以呢，拍面儿非常好。
最有排面儿。And so as you said earlier, the current tension between United States and China right now we're having is going through like a historical timeline. So 我想问的是，介于现在的紧张局势啊，美方与中方现在在进行一些交谈，对吧？所以说您对这次的紧张局势怎么看呢？然后is the current situation tension between the United States and China different from anything the two countries have experienced before, and how do you see it?
Great. Well, that's a great question to end it on. And 你的中文说的非常非常流利的。你是在美国出生的还是在中国出生的？
我是中国学生，从中国来的。
从中国来的留学生？
对，留学生。
啊，难怪你的中文说的特别特别好。So your question is, I think, is at the heart of understanding what is happening right now. I think you've asked one of the most important questions of the morning. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have had a number of crises with China over the 40 years that we've had a relationship. But those crises that we had were all emanated from an incident. Tiananmen Square, it was an incident. There was a crackdown on the students and a reaction by the international community. 1996 Missile Strait crisis. This was an incident based on a reaction to China launching missiles. The Belgrade embassy bombing, the EP3 crisis. These were all incidents, and we had to work through these and try to resolve them, use creative diplomacy, and get to a better place. What we're looking at now is very different. These are large geostructural issues. We're talking about fundamental long-term challenges that have to do with changing balances of power. And these challenges will be much more difficult to address and much more long-term in nature. I've been saying over the course of the hour, I've probably used the word competition maybe 25, 30 times, because this is a new feature in the U.S. China relationship. It has a lot to do with the fact that over the last 3 decades, China has grown in comprehensive national strength. It has a stronger economy. It has a stronger military. It is better on technology than it was before. And it has a lot of capacity that it did not have previously. We are moving to a global order where you have the United States and China as the two most powerful countries. And we may surpass other countries in the world by quite a bit. And you may have a world that consists of 2 superpowers, and the rest are sort of major countries, but they're not at the same level of the United States and China. Now, I don't think it's in our interest to get back to the kind of Cold War we saw between the United States and the Soviet Union, one that involved nuclear weapons, one that involved, serious threats on a daily basis and fear. We need to find, as I said earlier, we have to find a way to compete with China, but cooperate at the same time. We've never had a situation where two global powers like the United States and China have been able to achieve that. It is going to take young leaders like yourselves committed to working on these challenges in the future. For our country, for China, for the world, it is extremely important. This is the most consequential relationship in the globe. And I encourage all of you to continue to remain interested in China, travel to China, do as much as you can to try to help our two countries find their way to a more constructive relationship in the future. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the Garland campus, and also thank you very much to Mr. Haenle for taking your time to speak to us today. Thank you for taking your time to share your experience with us and give us all this new insight. If you're ever in Texas, you're more than welcome to swing by any of our campuses and watch us in action. Is there anything you would like to say before we go ahead and leave, Mr. Haenle?
Well, first, let me just say again, thank you. It's been a real honor to be your first speaker this year in the ILTexas Leadership Speaker Series. I've been thoroughly impressed with the questions and with the 非常流利的中文，我听到的给我深刻的印象，所以我想说非常感谢。And I hope to have an opportunity to visit you in Texas. If you're in China, please make sure that you reach out to me and come visit me at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center. And lastly, I have a podcast, which is called China in the World. And if you like podcasts, if you like listening, I interview Chinese scholars and American and other international experts talking about China and its evolving power and footprint in the world. And if you're interested in these issues we've discussed today, I think you'll be very interested in the podcast. So take a listen and please come visit in Beijing.
Absolutely, sir. We'll very much give that podcast a check. And on behalf of the ILTexas student body and staff, we would like to thank you again for providing us with your time this morning or this evening for you, and providing us with this new insight and knowledge. ILTexas Eagles, take flight.
Thank you. And you did a great job moderating.
Oh, thank you very much.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Have a restful night, sir.
Thank you. Good night.